All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at how to take those high-level environmental policies and turn them from nice-sounding paper promises into real-world action. Today's focus, Module 26, Chapter 2, specifically Annex A.8 of ISO 14001-2026. This is essentially the operational engine of an environmental management system. It's where the rubber actually meets the road, transforming theoretical commitments into physical realities right there on the shop floor.
We're going to break this down into 4 key areas: mastering operational control, applying the lifecycle perspective, managing outsourced processes, and finally, emergency preparedness.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, Mastering Operational Control. This brings us right to the core of your organization. What happens inside your own factory walls? This is where your day-to-day environmental impact is actually managed. Now, the big takeaway here is that operational control isn't just about drafting up administrative procedures or, having a massive binder full of rules collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. Why? Because when an operator is working a grueling 3 a.m. shift, a 50-page manual isn't going to stop a chemical tank from overflowing. It's about deploying actual, physical, and managerial safeguards that directly mirror your specific environmental risks. We're talking about structured management that keeps those impacts strictly within acceptable thresholds, basically taking human error totally out of the equation whenever we can.
We really have to move away from this reactive mindset. Running around with mops and absorbent pads after a chemical spill has already happened. Instead, Annex A.8 pushes us toward a proactive approach, prevention by design. That means building physical containment bonds around those tanks before a single drop hits the floor, and running simulation drills so your team acts on muscle memory, not panic. Honestly, a reactive approach is just an incredibly expensive, stressful cleanup job. Annex A.8 makes it crystal clear. Environmental management is not just a janitorial function. It is a core engineering and operational priority.
And these controls, they are incredibly diverse. A key thing to remember is that automated systems are just as vital as written procedures. People often think operational control just means slapping warning signs on a wall or a supervisor checking off a daily list. But think about an automated chemical dosing system that instantly shuts down a valve to prevent a discharge before a human even spots the issue. That is a perfect operational control. So are engineering emission filters, digital alerts popping up on a central dashboard, or just having highly competent, strictly trained supervisors right there on the floor. A highly trained person who actually understands the why behind a process is just as critical as the most advanced digital sensor out there.
Moving on to Section 2, the life cycle perspective. Now we're stepping outside those immediate factory walls and expanding our view upstream and downstream. You might be wondering, do we really need to model every single carbon molecule for every single product we make? Like, do we need a complex, full-blown scientific life cycle assessment just to stay compliant? Well, the answer is a resounding no. Annex A.8 explicitly busts that myth. Instead, it zeroes in on practical, proportionate influence across your value chain. Let's be real. ISO auditors don't expect you to magically control the weather or dictate a supplier's corporate structure down to the brand of coffee in their break room. You don't have to directly control these external entities, but you are expected to look at the upstream and downstream impacts of your decisions, specifically in areas where you actually have leverage and practical influence.
Let's look at how this actually plays out in the real world. Take an electronics company, for example. They might not physically mine the raw metals themselves, but they absolutely use their influence to mandate responsible practices from their suppliers. By deliberately choosing alternative, non-hazardous materials and rigorously auditing those suppliers, they are actively applying that life cycle perspective upstream. The big takeaway here? Procurement is now a frontline environmental control mechanism. Your corporate buying power is literally a regulatory tool shaping the behavior of your entire supply chain.
It's the exact same story downstream. Think about a food packaging company that designs with biodegradable materials. They can't control how the end consumer ultimately tosses the wrapper in the trash, right? But by designing that product for recyclability or biodegradability right from the start, they mitigate a massive environmental risk at the disposal stage. Suddenly, your engineering and R&D teams become vital environmental actors. That is what practical influence looks like in action.
All right, that brings us to Section 3, Managing Outsourced Processes. Here we hit our next triple, extending our control into those outsourced processes and the broader supply chain. Because let's face it, modern businesses do not operate in a vacuum. Now, while you directly manage your internal staff through daily training, building culture, and direct supervision on the floor, your outsourced controls require a totally different toolkit. You can't exactly stroll onto the factory floor and immediately course-correct a third-party contractor like you would your own employee. Since you lack that direct daily oversight, you really have to lean on robust contractual clauses, detailed performance scorecards, and rigorous routine compliance audits. That's how you ensure external partners are hitting your non-negotiable standards.
Think about this scenario for a second. If a contractor causes a chemical spill while, say, transporting your waste or cleaning out your storage tanks, whose environmental system actually failed? Under Annex A.8, the answer is yours. Outsourcing a process, like hazardous waste disposal or heavy facility maintenance, doesn't magically transfer your environmental responsibility or your reputational risk. You can't just point fingers at the vendor when things go south. You've got to maintain relentless oversight using established incident reporting channels and routine compliance verification to make sure those suppliers are perfectly aligned with your internal commitments.
And that leads us into Section 4, Emergency Preparedness and Response. This is the outer boundary of our influence, actually testing the system's resilience. Because no matter how solid your operational controls are, the unexpected is going to happen. Annex A.8 mandates a strict cycle for handling worst-case scenarios, essentially turning complex compliance rules into actionable, life-saving steps. You have to systematically identify potential emergencies, plan out the response, rigorously test those plans with real drills, and then, crucially, review the outcomes to continually improve. I really want to emphasize that last step, review and improve. So many companies run a drill just to check a box for the auditor and completely skip the review. But listen, if you run a drill, find a massive flaw in your response, and don't update your master plan, you haven't improved your readiness at all. You've literally just documented your own negligence.
So it's absolutely essential to plan for both ends of the spectrum. You need to prep for those routine, abnormal conditions, like a minor dripping pipe or a localized power failure. But you also have to prepare for the catastrophic what-if scenarios that truly push your boundary conditions. We are talking about low probability but incredibly high-impact events. Massive uncontrolled emissions, toxic gas releases, or severe 100-year natural disasters that take out your primary holding tanks. You've got to have airtight contingencies ready to go and standard operating procedures fly right out the window.
The source material hits on a really critical concept here. Emergency preparedness is a preventive risk management mechanism, not just a reactive response procedure. Let's be real, a paper plan is completely useless in the middle of an actual crisis. You have to validate your readiness through active spill simulation exercises and physical, boots-on-the-ground drills. Industry lore is full of stories about facilities that had beautifully bound emergency plans sitting on the manager's desk only to run a physical drill and realize the main shutoff valve was totally rusted shut, or the emergency spill kits were locked inside a security cage and the only guy with the key was on vacation. The whole point of a physical drill is to uncover those blind spots, anticipate the chaos, and ensure your resources are actually ready to deploy at a moment's notice.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 5, Integrating Environmental Operations.
Let's bring all these concepts together into one unified framework. Because, honestly, none of these elements work in isolation. They function like a highly interconnected web. A failure in one area immediately compromises all the others. For instance, if your outsourced processes are poorly managed and a contractor doesn't know how to handle a specific hazardous material on your site, well, your internal emergency plans might not be robust enough to stop the resulting environmental damage. The entire system only hums along when your internal controls, life cycle awareness, supply chain management, and emergency readiness are totally integrated and pulling in the exact same direction.
So here's the ultimate takeaway from ISO 14001:2026. Organizations remain fully accountable for the environmental consequences of outsourced processes, even when those specific activities are physically performed by external providers. Basically, outsourcing a task never means outsourcing your environmental responsibility. The legal, operational, and reputational accountability always rolls directly back to your brand. Your management system has to be robust and uncompromising enough to project your environmental standards across your entire value network.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to take a hard look at your own operations and ask yourself one critical question. Does your environmental responsibility truly stop at the factory gate? Based on everything we've unpacked from Annex 8 today, it's abundantly clear that true environmental management stretches way beyond your physical walls. It lives in the strict oversight of your supply chain, in the intelligent foresight of your product design, and in your uncompromising readiness for the unexpected. Thanks so much for joining me for this breakdown.